For keynote session, we are going to two presentations. The first one will be by Byungjong, Professor Byungjong, who is also Vice President of the Korean Association of Public Diplomacy, who will make a presentation on the topic of Korean public diplomacy, past, present, and future, which will be followed by President Cho Kisuk's presentation on the topic of a theoretical model on effective public diplomacy. Please do understand, because we are behind the schedule, I cannot give you 20 minutes maximum per presentation. Okay? So Professor Byungjong, would you please come first? Please give him a big hand.
네, 안녕하세요. 저도 한국말을 잘하는데 또 외교부에서 이 오전 세션은 영어로 진행을 부탁을 하셔서 영어로 하겠습니다. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. My name is Byungjong from Sookmyung Women's University. I am very honored to be the first presenter of this inaugural conference. And I'm very happy, honestly, to see so many faces, real faces, for the first time in many months, actually. Other than my family members' faces, I get to see your face in person. That's very good news for today. I'm also very happy in many ways. First of all, to be the first presenter, to congratulate this launching of this organization. And I feel like I'm attending a wedding ceremony, actually. It's because we have a kind of marriage today between academics and practitioners. This is a very rare moment that these two groups of people get together. So we have people from Foreign Ministry and Korea Foundation, and also scholars from many different universities. I'm also happy. I also feel like I'm attending a wedding ceremony because it's also marriage between two major disciplines in the study of public diplomacy. As we all know, the one area is, of course, international relation and political scientists who study this from their own point of view. The second group is, of course, the communication scholars like me. And again, for the first time, these two groups of scholars get together to discuss this matter today. And for that reason, I think it's a very, very meaningful and remarkable event. And before I start my presentation, again, my deepest gratitude to Professor Cho Kisuk for making this possible in such a short time. We worked for this for only 2 or 3 months, and we were able to have this great gathering. And it wouldn't have been possible without Professor Cho's hard work and dedication. And as we all know, Korean women are all superwomen, and she is the living example of these Korean superwomen. All right, without further ado, my presentation, I have only 20 minutes, and I've looked at Professor Cho's presentation, which is very, very academic, with a lot of concepts and everything, but mine will be half academic and half practical. Having this background as a journalist in the past, working for foreign media, I'll use that experience as a journalist for half of my presentation, and the other half would be hopefully more academic and theoretical. I'm supposed to talk about the past, present, and the future of public diplomacy. I'll try my best. Okay, I have only one slide to show, so it's not going to be that complicated for you. And here, I think it's very meaningful that we have this gathering and conference, particularly now, because as many of today's guest speakers mentioned, Korea is at a very critical moment in terms of public diplomacy. I think for the first time in, I guess, Korea's history, we receive so much attention from the global community, global media, and foreign leaders because of this particularly coronavirus situation, the way we handled very successfully to contain the spread of the virus, and it's receiving a lot of praises from all over the world. I should mention this because it's so important before I talk about the past and present. I think the living example of how we were able to receive global attention in a positive way was the fact recently that US President Trump invited Korea to join the G7 meeting in September, if it happens in Washington. And I don't know whether it will happen or not, but just the fact that he invited Korea to join this group of rich countries, advanced countries, means something. That means Korea's status in the world has been elevated, as you have mentioned, so much over the past few months. So now we are in par with other leading nations like the US and UK, particularly because those nations in the Western advanced societies, the way they handled coronavirus pandemic was so different from ours, and it was a big contrast. Our success and their failure that made our achievement so remarkable, and that was the reason why we had so much success. I've seen some officials from the foreign ministry here, and particularly in our class, we did a little study on the way the foreign ministry tried to promote our handling of the coronavirus. One example was the trust campaign. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this campaign by the foreign ministry to promote our way of handling the virus. And a lot of countries in the world are trying to emulate that case, I believe. But yes, we are receiving all those praises and attention at the moment, but as we all know, international environment is very, very precarious at the moment. People talk about a new Cold War, particularly between the US and China. So yesterday's compliment for us can turn into today's and tomorrow's criticism, depending upon how the pandemic situation unfolds. Korea can lose all the acclaims it gained recently, and with the emerging of a new Cold War caused mainly by growing hostilities between the US and China, international relations are increasingly becoming uncertain. Although I'm supposed to talk about the future, it's really up in the air. We don't even be able to forecast 6 months from now the way this virus will unfold and the way we will react to that. So I'll very much focus on the past and present, so that we can have some ideas on how the future will look like for Korea's public diplomacy. Incidentally, I did a study recently on Korea's 70 years of public diplomacy history. To be honest, we have Dr. Kim Tae-hwan from the Korea Diplomatic Academy, and I got a lot of ideas, borrowed a lot of ideas from his work, I confess here. In short, can I have the next page, please? Oh, I do that myself. Okay. All right, here. Okay. All right. This is a summary of the study I did recently. This, unfortunately, Professor Cho asked me to focus on the past 10 years, but without looking at the whole entire 70 years of Korea's history in public diplomacy, we cannot analyze the past 10 years. So I give you the whole 70 years. And Assemblyman Park Jin talked about the importance of messaging, sending messages in public diplomacy. So I kind of summarized the 6 key messages Korea tried to send to the world over the past 70 years. Okay, I hope you can all see it clearly. Starting from the 1948, the foundation of the modern Korea, the first period from 48 to 60, I would call it the key message of that time was nation building. Of course, right after we were created, the country was created. That was the message we sent to the whole world, particularly US and allies, our security allies. And at that time, according to my analysis, our communication for public diplomacy was very preliminary, very primitive, of course, very crude form of communication, mainly using human context and interpersonal communication. I'm moving on to the second stage, from 60 to 72. I would call this period the age of legitimacy competition between, again, South Korea and North Korea, and we are trying to be recognized by the whole world. At that time, surprisingly, North Korea was in many ways stronger and more famous than South Korea, economically, militarily, and all that. And we had to change all that perception from the global community. So we focused also very much on Western world. Basic publications was our main communication mode, like newsletters and newspapers. Third period, from 70 to 88, that time our message was economic development, of course. We were able to achieve some degree of development, and 88, of course, was the year of Seoul Olympics, and we used that moment to showcase our newfound prosperity. Print media like newspapers, international newspapers like the New York Times or Newsweek, which I used to work for as a journalist, so those media was primarily used during this time. You can take a look at other factors affecting those strategies and messages of Korea's public diplomacy. I analyzed both domestic and international factors affecting our change. Fourth period is from 88 to 98. It was political democracy, as we all know, and we began to expand our target audiences, not only West, but the East and China and other socialist countries. Broadcasting media, BBC, CNN, we began to do advertising on those international broadcasting media. Fifth period is dynamic Korea, I would call it. This is the time when we had the FIFA World Cup, and Korea Image Promotion Committee was created by the government, and the message was, of course, dynamic Korea. The key point was the cultural aspect of Korea, K-pop particularly, and K-movies and all that. And we began to use more advanced media for those communication. First generation digital media like newsletter, emails and homepages and so on. Final period up until today, I said 2018, but actually it applies to even today. I would call this period the message Global Korea. This was promoted by one administration, but I think the following administrations carry out this message of Global Korea, which focuses very much on multilateralism. We are moving from bilateralism to multilateralism and trying to play a more important, influential role in the global community, caring not just about our domestic national interests, but more on global issues as a very respected middle power country, of course. And the media mode at that time has further developed to include two-way social media, SNS, and all that. And I would call this 10 years period the period of public diplomacy formation, infrastructure formation. As we learned from our previous guests, this time, with this catchphrase of Global Korea, we participated in global affairs, G20 Summit, the Nuclear Security Summit, and other global events where we try to set the agenda and also frame discourses. You're not just following other people's agenda. So it was a big departure from old, very much security-focused bilateral diplomacy. And year 2010 was designated as the first year for public diplomacy. and public diplomacy ambassadorship was created, and the foreign ministry was officially mandated to handle the job with the enactment of the Public Diplomacy Act in 2016, and the current government carries out that mandate, and we have, so again, as seen in these 70 years of history, Korea's public diplomacy has evolved, has developed very slowly but surely, from very, again, primitive one-way message dissemination to more two-way engagement and relationship cultivation. More recently, now we have culture, knowledge, and policy as three major pillars of Korea's public diplomacy. And the way I interpret this three pillars, we want to be loved. We want foreigners to love about Korea through culture. We want them to know about Korea through knowledge. We want them to support Korea through policy. So these three pillars have all these interpretations, my opinion. So now we have facing the current stage of public diplomacy. We try to become responsible and respected middle power, ODA, PKO, KOICA. Those are some of the issues we are trying to use for that purpose. Environment, e-government, all these global issues, we try to be a part of a solution for those problems. And we have also evolved very much into more relational public diplomacy, very different from the previous informational advocacy diplomacy. So this is where we try to play some responsible role in the in the international community. I can give you an example. I was able to last year to review some of the cases, public diplomacy cases carried out by Korea's central government as well as foreign ministry. One example was done in Jakarta, Indonesia, and I think it received a big prize from the foreign ministry as an excellent PD case. It was a cross-country outreach program by the embassy in Jakarta. They traveled like 5 days, 6 days for 1,000 kilometers in a bus. The ambassador and other staff members rode a bus and traveled whole Indonesia to interact and engage and build relationship and listen to local people. So, and more recently, our current status focuses on helping other countries through the collaborative public diplomacy. We are trying to work with many different countries. The foreign ministry is at the forefront of this effort, trying to connect with other countries and international organizations, WHO. Of course, I mean, its existence is questioned by the US and many countries, but still we are trying to work multilaterally with these organizations. Yet, I should, I know don't have much time, but I can finish with some caution. Although we focus very much on very relational, very engaging, inclusive public diplomacy, we still practice old style, more or less propaganda, not propaganda, Cold War style confrontational public diplomacy. The example I can give you is our exchange of all those rhetorics with Japan last year and this year for historical and trade and territorial issues. And this happens even now. So we are not doing all the good, positive, contributing public diplomacy. We also engage in very harsh, rather confrontational public diplomacy at the same time. And this is a trend in the world, not just in Korea. The Trump's, America First, Brexit, and all this, the revival of nationalism and populism is a big danger for public diplomacy in the world. And we are facing the same risks and dangers. So that is why I think, so let me just read some of these this public diplomacy is based on the growing importance of public and public opinion and media-related public opinion. Yes, it's all good for the democratization of diplomacy, but too much democratization sometimes also poses dangers. Politicization, I think somebody mentioned that today, politicization of diplomacy can be risky at times. Sometimes it's better to be handled by experts, professional career diplomats for some issues. So there's that danger everywhere, but particularly in Korea. So I would think that will be a challenge. How can we make our public diplomacy more apolitical, more neutral, so that even if we have a new government, every 5 years we have a new government, and the problem, a lot of foreign diplomats complain that Korean diplomacy, public diplomacy, to changes overnight, like flip-flop all the time. So that's the criticism we get, and how can we prevent that kind of policy change, policy interruptions, and I think the creation of this kind of civil organization, like our association today, will be very important in managing this kind of, in helping depoliticize our diplomacy and public diplomacy. So for that reason, I think this organization particularly has to remain neutral and try to be objective. No matter what kind of, regardless of what kind of government comes in, we can carry out the same consistent and coherent public diplomacy studies and policy suggestions for the coming administrations. Okay, so again, for that reason, I'm very positive that the future will look better, and because we've evolved and developed continuously, I think this trend will continue if we do, heed this kind of warnings and dangers. All right, that's all I have for today. Thank you for listening. And if you have time, maybe later you can give me some feedback and questions, and I would very appreciate that. Thank you again very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Byungjong, for your punctuality. Well, now, last but not least, we have President Cho's presentation. Can I ask you to make it in like 15 minutes?
Good morning again. And my paper in Korean, the titled like 공공외교의 이론화를 위하여, searching for a theory in public diplomacy. And I just decided to present a theoretical model on effective public diplomacy. What's the purpose of this association? And if you ask me like that, then I would say to create theories that can be applied to practices in the field, not the body of knowledge we pursued in discipline. I think PD is a field, not an academic discipline. And in academic field, what do we pursue? The practical knowledge. So our goal is to develop theories that can be applied in the field. So I'm going to first show the current status of PD research in Korean academia. I searched for all the PD literature since 2003 because that was marked as the first PD publication. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the problems lies in soft power conceptualization that the President Lee have pursued so far. And thirdly, I will present my model And fourthly, let me briefly summarize just the preliminary outcome, because I conducted a research on 9 country cases: Korea, US, China, Russia, Japan, Germany, UK, France, and Sweden. So just preliminary research outcome. And I'm going to talk about finally the implications for Korea. What can we learn from these 9 country cases? Okay. And these are the number of PD publications in Korea since 2002 up to today. And it is interesting to note that the publication, 이게 안 되냐? 이거 안 싸지는데? As you can see, publication exponentially increases up to 2014. And 이쪽을 향해서 쏘라고? 아니 이건 되는데 라이트 포인터가 안 돼. 포인터가 안 돼. Okay. So as you can see, it exponentially increases up to 2014 and then decreases and almost dropped in 2018 and then recovered to the level of 2014 in 2019. And what does this tell us? This is just my hunch. And what happened? What do you think happened in 2014? I haven't conducted any serious research yet, but this is just my guess that 2014, we all remember it was sunken Seoul, ferry. And afterwards, the scholars were not motivated to conduct any research on public diplomacy because our image was tainted and ruined already. So what? How are we going to make any difference by studying and publishing public diplomacy literature? That's my sense. And then why it came back dramatically in 2019? Democratic government. And scholars are motivated to conduct research because we are now living in a democracy and public diplomacy can make a difference. And these are the frequency of publication by PD policy area. And as you can see, most of the research was conducted in policy diplomacy. And next is knowledge diplomacy. And knowledge diplomacy includes language, science and technology, and cultural diplomacy is the next. It was not knowledge diplomacy. What is it? Legal. And actually, the second most was the legal and institutional studies because policy scientists conducted a lot of research in this area, and the other area is comparatively less. And this is the frequency of publication by PD academic field. And it resembles the trend of the PD policy area. It's very similar. So predominantly, the research was conducted by political scientists and social scientists. And still, we have very little literature in communications and public relations. But the trend is not the same in the US. Most of the PD research has been conducted by communication scholars. So I think we should encourage communication scholars more to conduct research. And this is the frequency of publication by methodological approach. And you can see predominantly descriptive studies, case studies, historical studies predominate the other areas. And particularly, there are some conceptual studies, but very little comparative study or empirical studies. So we have to encourage more in the least studied methodologies. Then, in theorizing PD, I think we should overcome this conceptualization debate of soft power, because soft power has been the key concept in public diplomacy due to Joseph Nye. And Nye defined soft power in three different words. Its cultural resources and political values and its foreign policies. And the problems that I find from NICE conception is that the variables at the three different levels are confused. So for example, diplomatic outcome is not separated from soft power resources and political system. They are all mentioned in the same dimension. And secondly, because of this overemphasis on soft power, it projects an illusion that successful PD can increase the magnitude of soft power. But it seldom happens, right? It seldom happens. So if not, many believe that PD is regarded as a failure. So in fact, it happened in many countries. After pouring thousands of dollars in PD, and they didn't find any increase in soft power, so they cut the budget in PD. It's of no use. So we should not give that kind of illusion to the public officials. And third, the dependent variables and independent variables are tautologically intertwined. That means soft power is a dependent variable. So for example, above, foreign policy, I think is a dependent variable. And the culture and values are the independent variable. So in NICE conceptualization, dependent variable and independent variable coexist. That means this soft power does not explain anything, right? So in order to overcome this, I created this model to distinguish between soft power inherited from the history, past history, and soft power that can be increased or enlarged by the success of the public diplomacy. So the past history actually shapes not only the magnitude of soft power, but also that of hard power. And actually, many includes some hard power elements in defining soft power. But if we do that, then we cannot analyze. So I want to separate between hard power and soft power so that we can analyze. And I discovered that these two are interacting, but asymmetrically. And hard power influences the magnitude of soft power to a great extent, but not vice versa. And then these hard power and soft power affect many variables within the political system. And these political system variables are influenced by external shocks, such as COVID pandemic, or communication, technological innovation, and etc. So within the political system, I hypothesized these 5 variables that might affect the outcome of the PD. And those are ideas, institutions, governance, leadership, and communication system. And you might be questioned why you separate between governance and communication system. Because I think these two can be distinguishable because Japan has a democratic governance on its surface, but their communication system is very much closed. So as we have witnessed the crisis during the Fukushima nuclear power plant explosion, their closed communication system really ruined their country's image, and their branding dropped very much. So here again, I want to emphasize the ideas. We always talk about ideas, but these ideas are actually inherit from our ancestors. And these ideas, when it operates well in the political system, it affects PD. The fact that we have great ideas from our ancestors doesn't really matter. So in that sense, we have to separate the two different concepts of ideas. And then to assess the success of the PD, I try to use the effectiveness measure. Although it will be, finally, we will employ perception analysis to measure the effectiveness. So in order to measure that, I separated PD input, output, and outcome. And the final impact will feedback not only PD input, but also the soft power. So most of the soft power is inherited from the past history, but a little bit of marginal magnitude of soft power will be influenced by the outcome of the PD. So using this model, let me just briefly mention why historical context is so much important. Because if you look at the measurement of soft power, it's not free from our past experience and the imperial, particularly imperial, during the imperial period. So diplomatic relations is already set by past history. So one typical example is Japan. Without their sincere apology, China and Korea will never have, Japan cannot enlarge soft power among Koreans and Chinese. So in order to not to give an illusion that the successful PD can enlarge soft power, we have to separate the soft power inheritance from soft power that we can make a difference. And effective PD could be influenced by the political system, not only by MOFA, but also by all these factors. So I will skip. And so PD policy effectiveness, input, output, outcome, I was inspired by the PR assessment tool, but the contents are different. So as the Vice Minister Ewha mentioned, the budget organization personnel is the basic input. And output are the PD programs and activities. And outcome is the outcome and impact. And we can measure outcome in 3 dimensions: affective, cognitive, and normative dimension. And there are mediating variables. 2 mediating variables are host country's public perception and the non-state actors in civil society. Every country has their very unique non-state actors. So for example, Japan and Germany, they have foundations which are very active in PD, far from the government. And in the US, they have Hollywood and really pop cultural community, which is always anti-government when the Republican president is in power. And so the reason that then how do we measure what are the factors that affect this host country's public? And I think the materialist versus post-materialist, the classification can help us to understand the nature of the public in the host countries. So for example, China is very popular in African countries, but very unpopular in European countries. And why? It depends on the nature of the public in those countries. And African countries are still very much materialistic, and they love money. They love huge investment by China. But in European countries, if the country is autocratic, not democratic, then they hate it. So the China, why? Because most of the European publics are very much post-materialistic. They're very much value-oriented. They emphasize human rights and democracy. So feedback, as I already mentioned, is very much important. And through this feedback, I think we can enlarge the marginal magnitude of the soft power. Then what's the preliminary research outcome? And first, the most important factor was ideas and values. But not only if they have long tradition of these ideas and values, because it's credible, so they are likely to be successful. And the examples are US, UK, France over China, Russia, Korea. We have short history, that's why still we have, some way to go. And so success is determined by the consistency between ideas inherited and operating in the system. So that's why Barack Obama and Tony Blair and Angela Merkel were successful. However, when there was a discrepancy between ideas inherited and operating in the system, as we witnessed during George Bush administration and Donald Trump, and their image, country image, plummeted. So that's the first outcome. And second research outcome is that the next important factors were governance and communication system. So still Japan is more successful than China or Russia in terms of democratic governance. But in communication system, Korea's COVID-19 was more successful than Japanese COVID management, and also the Japanese Fukushima nuclear power plant explosion. And in case of Korea, sunken cruise ship in Budapest was much more well dealt by the government than sunken Sewol ferry. So within Korea, in the same society, depending on their communication, the government's communication system, we got two different results. And the last outcome that I like to share is I hypothesized these two factors, whether they can affect the PD, but these were less relevant or even irrelevant. And for example, I was interested in this, whether presidential system or parliamentary system, which one is more conducive to successful PD, and no difference, because the parliamentary country like UK or Germany was successful, as much successful as US, the presidential system. And the another was leadership. Who initiated this PD policy? Does it make any difference in terms of success? And I couldn't find any difference, because the top leaders, when top leaders initiated PD policy, like Tony Blair of UK and Junichiro Koizumi of Japan, both were successful. And also, when George Bush initiated new PD during his term, but he failed, and Lee Myung-bak, he even created the National Brand Committee. He failed, and it was dissolved after his term. And Putin, you witnessed, how much money he poured in Sochi Olympic, but it was a total failure. So it didn't matter. Some countries were successful, and some countries will failing. So, and what about Minister of Foreign Affairs initiate this new PD policy? In case of Germany, the Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier, he initiated, but Germany was also successful, so it doesn't matter. And what about high-level public officials? It's very interesting. When Japan initiated PD at the beginning in 1970s, public officials, high-level public officials initiated, just like in Korea. So, which level, at which level initiates the public diplomacy policy, it didn't affect the success or failure. Okay? Then, conclusion. Am I on the right track in terms of time? Final conclusion, okay? Then what do we learn from these 9 case studies? And the National Assemblyman Park Jin mentioned very important thing, and he said that we should ask us who we are and where we are heading toward, and what is our vision for Korea and Asia. And I think we should ask this very seriously. So we should ask who we are, because we have to define our values. And particularly when we define our values from our tradition, we are likely to be successful, because it saves our time and energy to build consensus among the people. So in order to build bipartisan consensus on our identity, it will be effective if we search it from our traditional values. And Mr. Han Chung-hee mentioned 홍익인간, and actually this 홍익인간 comes from 경천애인. And this goes back to our Dangun myth and also Joseon dynasty. So we have long tradition of this. And this 경천애인 means we love nature, meaning peace and harmony and people. So the COVID-19 management was successful because the current administration focused on people and people's lives. And also our modernization and democratization, I think this is the time to shake hands between modernization bloc and democratization bloc and acknowledge each other's contribution and accomplishments for the nation. And these all benefited our people economically and politically, right? And next, these values should permeate in every area of the policy. Policy diplomacy, knowledge diplomacy, and cultural diplomacy. These values should be, penetrated. And thirdly, we have to make tailor-made messages to the target audiences in host countries, because who we are will be determined by how they perceive us, right? And as I told you earlier, this materialist versus post-materialist is just one example, but unless we understand their culture and their history, unless we find commonalities between their history and our history, we are not successful in persuading them. So the tailor-made message is very much important. And finally, this is, I think, the most important thing. That means there exists priority in terms of policy area. And MOFA, particularly the Department of this Public Diplomacy and Culture, they are pouring a lot of efforts in cultural diplomacy and knowledge diplomacy and policy diplomacy. But something happens like Sewol Ferry accident, that ruins the whole endeavor of no use. So what I'm trying to say that there is a priority. That means what is the most important one? That is foreign policy and domestic policy. So the best foreign policy and domestic policy is the best PD, just like best PR is the best policy, right? Best policy is the best PR. So we should not forget this. So when PD fails because of the government, don't blame MOFA, blame the top leadership, right? So if we separate all variables like this, then I think we will be able to conduct more analytic analysis, comparative analysis, and empirical analysis. And I hope you will join me in advancing and developing this model further. Thank you very much for your listening.
Well, thank you very much, Professor this time, as a scholar, Professor Cho Kisuk. And I'm really sorry to have a designated time for Q&A for this session, but then I hope we could have some time for afternoon sessions. So we are going to close the morning session entirely, and then we're going to get started with the luncheon. Luncheon will be right at this place. Okay. Please be seated as you are, and the meal will be served right at this place. Thank you very much.